The cave did not give up its secrets easily. That was what Dr. Patricia Holloway said to her graduate student on the morning of September 14, 1983. When they finally squeezed through the narrow fissure behind the frozen curtain of Alderman Falls and stood upright in the dark, breathing air that had not moved in decades. Patricia was 51 years old, a professor of Appalachian archaeology at the University of Virginia, and she had spent the better part of 2 years tracking down rumors of this place. Old land records, a footnote in a botanical journal from 1903, a deed of mineral claim filed in the Augusta County Courthouse by a woman named Willa Moss in the winter of 1881. She had followed that thread through courthouse archives and university libraries and the faded memories of very old people in very small towns until it led her here to the granite face of a mountain in the Blue Ridge, to a waterfall and a crack in the rock that most people would have walked past without a second glance. Her student, a young man named Daniel, swept his flashlight across the cavern wall. The beam caught something and held it. Lines of charcoal, small and precise, arranged in careful columns on the smooth stone surface. Not the crude scratching of someone passing through. The deliberate accounting of someone who intended to stay. Daniel leaned close and read aloud, his voice hushed with the instinctive reverence people feel in places that carry weight. Day 1. Corn 42 handfuls. Patricia stood very still. She had spent her career studying what people left behind. She knew the difference between objects abandoned in flight and objects arranged with intention. Whatever this place was, whoever had made it home, they had done so with a clear mind and a steady hand. She pressed her palm flat against the cool stone beside the charcoal tally. The rock held a stillness that went beyond temperature, the stillness of a place that had been waiting a long time and had learned patience. She did not know yet that the woman who had written those words had been 19 years old alone and had been left on the mountain to die. She would spend the next 3 years learning that story, and when she finally understood it, it would change everything she thought she knew about survival, about knowledge, and about who truly owns the land beneath our feet. But the story did not begin in 1983. It began in October of 1880 with a man's rage and a torn piece of paper and a girl walking out into the rain. The Blue Ridge in autumn is a country of impossible beauty. The ridgelines burn with color red and gold, and a deep arterial orange that seems to pulse against the gray October sky. The rivers run cold and clear over beds of dark granite. The air smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the first faint warning of the cold to come. To a traveler passing through it, looks like paradise. To someone who has lived in it, who has worked its rocky soil and felt its winters settle into their bones, it is something more complicated than paradise. It is a place that demands everything. It takes what it needs and gives back only what you have earned. Willa Moss had earned very little in her 19 years, but she had learned in those 19 years what it felt like to earn something honestly and have it taken away. She had been 12 years old when her mother, a woman named Ruth Moss, had pressed a pen into Willa's small hand and guided it across the bottom of a document she was too frightened and too sick to sign herself. The document was an indenture contract. 7 years of labor in exchange for housing, food, and a small sum of money to be paid at the contract's end. The man on the other side of the table was Edmund Hale, who owned the largest farm in the Hemlock Creek Valley, a man with a wide red face and small watchful eyes who smiled with his mouth but not with anything else. Ruth Moss was dying of consumption. She had been dying of it for 2 years slowly and expensively, and the money for doctors and medicine had come from places that were running out. The house was already mortgaged. The small vegetable garden was already stripped. There was no one else. Willa's father had gone west 3 years before and sent one letter, and then nothing. There were no aunts, no uncles, no neighbors close enough or solvent enough to take in a 12-year-old girl. Edmund Hale had presented himself as a solution. He was doing the family a kindness, he said. The girl would have a roof over her head, food in her stomach, a trade to learn. When her 7 years were done, she would be a capable young woman with money in her pocket and a future ahead of her. He had said all of this very gently, with his hands folded on the table and his small eyes moving between Ruth Moss's pale, exhausted face and the document lying between them. Ruth had looked at her daughter. Willa had been standing in the doorway of the bedroom listening. She was 12 and she understood more than they thought she did. She understood that her mother was afraid and that fear was making this man seem more generous than he was. but she also understood that she was 12 years old and that the winter was coming and that the house was going to be taken and that her mother could barely sit upright. She walked to the table and took the pen from her mother's hand. She signed her name in careful, deliberate letters. Willa Moss. She had learned to write from the Methodist minister's wife who ran a small school out of her parlor on Tuesday afternoons, and she was proud of her handwriting. She wanted Edmund Hale to see that she was not ignorant, that whatever she was agreeing to it with her eyes open. Hale had looked at her signature and smiled his mouth-only smile and said very quietly that this was going to work out very well for everyone. Her mother died 4 months later. Willa did not go to the funeral. She was needed at the farm. 7 years is a long time when you are 12. It is a childhood and a young womanhood compressed into a single unbroken stretch of labor. Willa carried water and split wood and scrubbed floors and mended fences and worked in the kitchen from before dawn to after dark. She was not beaten. Edmund Hale was not that kind of man, or at least not that obvious a kind. He was the kind of man who used withholding as a weapon, withholding warmth, withholding approval, withholding the small kindnesses that make a life bearable. He fed her adequately. He housed her in a room above the barn that was cold in winter and suffocating in summer. He spoke to her rarely, and when he did, it was to correct or to direct or to remind her in a tone of flat, patient contempt that she was there on his charity and should not forget it. His son, Roy Hale, was 24 and had inherited his father's small eyes and his father's certainty that the world owed him more than it was currently delivering. Roy drank more than his father and thought less, which made him more dangerous in the immediate sense, though less calculating in the long one. He did not bother Willa in the way she had feared he might, but he watched her in a way that made her careful to never be in a room alone with him after dark. 3 years from the end of her contract, Willa had begun to quietly count. She kept the count in her head, a private calendar, marking off the days the way a prisoner marks them on a wall. 1,095 days, then 900, then 800. She did not let herself think about what came after in any specific way, because specific hope was dangerous. It made the waiting harder. She kept herself narrow and focused on the immediate, the present task the next hour. She was good at that. It was perhaps the most useful thing Edmund Hale had accidentally taught her. Then on the 14th night of October 1880, in the middle of a cold rain, he called her into the main house and tore her contract in half. She had not done anything. That was the part that stayed with her in the first hours of walking when her mind was still trying to make sense of what had happened. She had not broken anything stolen, anything said anything that could be construed as defiance. He had simply been in a mood, the particular mood that whiskey and some private dissatisfaction created in him, a mood in which the world was failing to meet his expectations, and someone needed to be made to feel it. She had been standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been at the table with a glass and a bottle. Roy had been in the corner watching. Edmund Hale had looked at her for a long moment and then said with a kind of flat exhaustion that she was useless, that she was a drain, that he had kept his end of the agreement for 7 years, which was more than could be said for most men, and that he was done. He picked up the contract from the table where he apparently kept it close at hand and tore it in two. Then he held the pieces out to her, an offering or an insult, she was never quite sure which. Willa looked at the torn paper in his outstretched hand. She thought about her mother guiding her small hand to the pen. She thought about the signature she had made so carefully with such deliberate clarity, wanting him to see that she was not ignorant. She took the pieces from his hand. She looked at him for one moment. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would matter to a man like Edmund Hale, and she had learned in 7 years not to spend words on things that would not matter. Then she turned and walked out of the house into the rain. She had her dress, her boots, a coat that was too thin for October, and half a loaf of stale bread she had slipped from the kitchen that afternoon, without knowing why, some instinct operating below conscious thought. She had the 2 halves of the torn contract, which she folded and put inside her coat against her skin. She did not know why she kept them. She simply could not make herself throw them away. The rain came down cold and sideways. The farm lane was already mud. She walked down it and turned north onto the main road and kept walking because stopping was not an option and going back was not an option, and so forward was the only direction that existed. She walked through the night. In the 10 miles of valley between Edmund Hale's farm and the base of the mountain, There was a settlement called Hemlock Creek. 40 or so families scattered along the creek bottom, a general store, a mill, a Methodist church, and a one-room schoolhouse that served as the center of whatever civic life the community managed to sustain. The schoolhouse had a teacher. His name was Owen Greer, and he had been in Hemlock Creek for 2 years, arriving from Philadelphia, with a teaching certificate, a trunk of books, and a set of ideas about the redemptive power of education that the mountains had been quietly disassembling ever since. Owen was 37 years old, thin in the manner of men who forget to eat when they are thinking, with round spectacles that were always slightly crooked, and a habit of turning whatever was in his hands over and over while he talked as if trying to read it from all angles. He had come from a world of libraries and lecture halls, and he had not fully understood before he arrived in Hemlock Creek how different it was to teach a child to read when that child would rather be helping with the harvest, or how difficult it was to maintain enthusiasm for the work when the winter was settling in and the firewood supply was looking thin. He was by the autumn of 1880 a somewhat disillusioned man, not broken, not ready to leave, but quieter than he had been. The romantic ideas had given way to something more modest and more durable, a simple, stubborn conviction that the work mattered even when the results were slow. He taught, he kept teaching. He told himself that was enough. He was a man who read everything he could find, which in Hemlock Creek was not much. He had read and reread his trunk of books until they were soft with handling. He subscribed to 2 newspapers which arrived weeks late, crumpled, and sometimes incomplete, but which he read with the concentrated attention of someone receiving dispatches from a distant country. It was in one of these newspapers, a copy of the Raleigh Observer from the previous spring, that he had encountered a short article about the Cherokee syllabary, the writing system developed in the early 19th century that had allowed the Cherokee people to create a written language in the span of a single generation. The article was brief and imprecise in its details, but it included a partial chart of the syllabary characters alongside their phonetic equivalents. Owen had cut this out and pinned it above his desk. He was not sure why exactly. He found languages fascinating in an abstract way, the puzzle of how different peoples had solved the same problem of making thought permanent. He looked at the characters sometimes in the evenings, tracing their shapes with his finger, trying to hear the sounds they represented. In the evenings, he worked through the partial chart with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He identified patterns. He made hypotheses about the characters the article had not included, working from the internal logic of the ones he knew. It was the kind of problem that suited his particular mind, structured, but not mechanical, requiring both precision and imagination. He had no idea that this habit, this idle intellectual persistence, would matter to anyone other than himself. On the morning after Willa walked out of Edmund Hale's house, Owen Greer was in his schoolroom building the morning fire and listening to the rain. He did not yet know that a girl had been cast out into the mountain. He would not know for weeks. When he finally learned it, he would feel something he could not quite name, a mixture of anger and shame that people in the valley had simply accepted the disappearance of a 19-year-old girl as a natural consequence of the mountains. But that morning he fed wood to the fire and listened to the rain and thought about the day's lessons. He was someone who would matter later. For now he was simply a man alone in a cold room doing his best with what he had. Willa walked for 3 days. The first day was the longest because it was the day she was still inside the shock of what had happened, moving through it the way you move through chest-deep water, every step requiring more effort than it should. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the cold remained, a wet, clinging cold that got into the spaces between her skin and her clothes and stayed there. She moved through the trees on the mountain's lower slopes away from the main road because she was not yet sure who knew what had happened, and she did not want to be seen, did not want the conversation that being seen would require. She ate a piece of this bread. She drank from a creek lying flat on the bank with her face close to the water. She kept moving. By the second day, the bread was gone, and hunger had settled into something more physical and less ignorable. She knew the general principle that the forest was full of things to eat. She knew chestnuts fell in October. She found some, cracked them open on a rock, ate them. They were bitter, but they were something. She found a seep of water coming out of a mossy bank and drank carefully, and then sat for a while with her back against a tree, listening to the forest. She was good at stillness. She had learned it in the barn room in the years of having no privacy except the privacy of her own mind, making herself very quiet and very internal while the world did what it did around her. She sat against the tree and listened, and the forest did not feel hostile. It felt indifferent, which was different. Indifference she could work with. She climbed higher on the third day, not because she had decided to, but because the terrain pushed her that way, the rhododendron thickets forcing her upward along the paths of least resistance, the steep gullies offering routes that were difficult but passable. She was a smudge of brown homespun moving through the turning gold and copper of the poplars, a figure in flight that the mountain was slowly absorbing into itself. The sky had been building all day, bruising purple and green at the edges, the light going flat and strange. She knew what that sky meant. She pushed harder, looking for anything, a rock overhang, a dense stand of hemlocks, any structure that would give her some protection from what was coming. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The first drops were cold enough to feel like small stones against her skin. Then the rain became something else. It stopped being individual drops and became a force, a sheet of moving water that turned the forest floor into sliding mud and reduced visibility to a few feet in any direction. The cold came with it, a vicious, seeking cold that found every gap in her clothing and pressed through. She felt her hands going numb first, then her feet, then the steadily narrowing margins of her thinking as her body began to divert resources inward, protecting the core at the expense of the extremities. She knew with the animal certainty of someone who has always lived close to the physical world that this was how people died. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in stages, each stage a little harder to come back from than the last. She was already past the first stage. She needed shelter in the next few minutes, not the next few hours. She pushed through the last screen of dripping hemlock branches and heard it before she saw it. A sound beneath the sound of the rain, deeper and more constant, a hiss that spoke of enormous volumes of moving water. She followed it, stumbling over rocks she could not see until the trees opened, and she was standing at the edge of a granite cliff. The waterfall dropped 60 feet in a single sheet of white before it hit the pool below. In the gray rain light, it was enormous and wild, completely indifferent to the tiny human standing at its edge. The spray came back from the pool in a fine mist that coated everything within 20 feet. But she was not looking at the waterfall. She was looking at the space behind it. The cliff face behind the falling water was set back far enough that the water cleared it by several feet, leaving a strip of dark, dry rock. And in that dark rock, about 15 feet above the base of the cliff, there was a shadow that was the wrong shape. Not the smooth shadow of a flat surface, the irregular inward shadow of an opening. She got to it by traversing a ledge of granite that she would later think about and understand had been extremely dangerous, especially in the rain, especially with numb hands. But at the time, she simply did it because it was there, and because the alternative was dying in the open. The fissure was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders. She turned sideways and pushed through, scraping her back against the stone, and found herself in a passage that angled upward into the rock. The roar of the waterfall dropped immediately to a deep, resonant hum, like the low string of a massive instrument. The wind died. The cold receded. She crawled upward through the dark passage for what she estimated was 20 feet, moving by touch, her hands on walls that were surprisingly smooth and dry. Then the passage opened, and she could stand. She stood in the dark and felt the cavern around her. She felt it the way you feel a room when your eyes are closed, in the scale of the silence, the weight of the space above her head, the quality of the air. The air was cool but not cold and still, and it smelled of something old, something dry and mineral, and underneath that faintly organic. She stood for a long time just breathing. The sound of her own heartbeat was very loud in the stillness. The waterfall hummed somewhere behind the stone wall, a sound that had already started to feel less like weather and more like the building itself settling around her. When she moved carefully, her hands outstretched. Her fingers found the wall, followed it, and then found something else entirely. Curved, smooth, fired, clay. She crouched down and felt with both hands. It was a pot large and heavy resting on the stone floor. Beside it was another, and another. They were arranged in a line against the wall, each one sealed at the top with a clay plug that had hardened to stone. She moved further along the wall and her hands found other things. Folded hides stacked in layers, impossibly soft and supple, even in the cold dark. Tools made of bone and flint. A small pouch of deerskin tied with sinew that turned out to contain needles so fine and delicate she was afraid she would break them just by holding them. She sat down on the floor of the cavern with the needle pouch in her hands and thought about what this meant. This was not a cave that nature had stocked. Every object had been placed here by deliberate human hands. The pots were sealed, the hides were folded, the tools were arranged. This was not abandoned. It was stored. There was a difference, and the difference was enormous. Abandoned things said we left and did not come back. Stored things said we left and planned to return. But the dust. She could feel it on every surface, a thick, undisturbed layer that her hands disturbed when she moved across it. Whatever planning had been done here, the return had never happened. Something had intervened between the planning and the returning. She sat with that for a long time in the dark, listening to the rain diminish to a murmur outside the stone. Sometime later, when the last of the shivering had subsided and her hands had returned to something like normal feeling, she found the map. She had been exploring further back into the cavern, following the wall with her hand, when her fingers found a different texture on the stone. Not rock, not clay, something flexible that gave slightly under her touch. She worked it loose from where it had been tucked into a natural alcove in the wall and brought it back toward the faint gray light that filtered through the passage from outside. It was a piece of buckskin, large, maybe 2 feet across and 3 feet long, carefully prepared and softened to a pale parchment color. On its surface, drawn in dark pigment that had remained crisp despite the years, were lines and symbols. She could see by the faint light that the lines were a map. The river was there. The ridgeline was there. The waterfall was marked with a symbol. And from that symbol, other lines branched outward, leading deeper into the mountain, pointing to other symbols in a script she had never seen before and could not read at all. But she knew what it was. She had heard people in the valley talk about the Cherokee who had lived in these mountains before the removal, before the long march west that had taken them from the land they had named and mapped and known for generations. She knew this was their writing. She could not read it, but she could see even in the thin light that it was not crude. It was deliberate, complex, and elegant. She held the map in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she pressed her hand flat on the stone floor. The rock was cool and solid and absolutely real. She spoke very quietly into the dark to no one, or perhaps to whoever had carried these pots up the mountain and sealed them with such patient care. Someone thought about the people who would come after. She did not cry. She had not cried when Hale tore the contract. She did not cry now. She simply sat with the map in her hands and let the knowledge of the place settle into her, let herself understand what it was offering. It was not a gift exactly. Gifts implied a relationship, a giver and receiver who knew each other. This was something older and stranger than a gift. It was more like a message in a bottle cast into the future by people who could not know who would find it, only that someone would. She was the someone. She thought about Edmund Hale rounding the bottle of whiskey in his warm kitchen. She thought about Roy Hale watching her walk out into the rain. She thought about all the men in the valley below who owned the deeds to things they did not understand. She did not know yet about the second chamber. She did not know about the vein of mica in the back wall, or the underground reservoir, or the seeds in the sealed pots, whose nature would astonish scientists a century later. She did not know that a school teacher in the valley below had a newspaper clipping pinned above his desk that held the key to what was written on the map in her hands. She only knew what was immediately in front of her, which was more than she had ever had before. She folded the map carefully along its original creases and tucked it against her skin next to the two halves of her torn indenture contract. She pulled one of the folded hides from the stack against the wall and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was impossibly warm for something that had been in a cold cavern for decades. The tanning was extraordinary. The skin worked to a softness and density that held warmth the way wool held it without the weight. She thought of the hands that had done that work, the care and skill and hours it had represented. She did not know whose hands they had been, but she felt them as a presence in the room. Not supernatural, not frightening, simply present in the way that the work of careful hands always persists in the object they have touched. That night she pulled the hide around her shoulders and settled her back against the wall of the cave, beside the sealed pots and the folded hides and the small pouch of needles too delicate to break. She listened to the waterfall. It had changed register as the rain slowed, moving from a roar to something more measured and rhythmic, a sound that after a few minutes stopped feeling like noise and started feeling like company. She did not sleep for a long time. She sat in the dark and thought clearly and practically about what came next. The order of things. When she finally slept, it was deeply the sleep of someone who has made a decision and put down the weight of the uncertainty that preceded it. 10 miles down the mountain in his farmhouse kitchen, Edmund Hale poured the last inch of whiskey into his glass and said to his son without particular feeling that the girl was probably dead by now. The mountain took fools in October. It was a simple fact. Roy said nothing. He was looking out the kitchen window at the dark shape of the ridge against the cloudy sky. He stood there a moment longer than was natural. Then he pulled the curtain and went to bed. The mountain held its secrets, the waterfall kept its sound, and in a cavern that no living person knew existed, Willa Moss slept with a Cherokee hide pulled around her shoulders and a map she could not yet read pressed against her heart. She would not be going back down. She began with the counting. It was the first thing she did on the morning after the storm, when the waterfall had settled back to its steady register and a thin gray light was filtering through the passage from outside. She did not allow herself to sit and feel the weight of what she was facing. She did not allow herself to think about Edmund Hale, or the torn contract, or the world below the mountain that had decided she was disposable. She allowed herself only the immediate, the present, the inventory of what existed and what it meant. She had learned this discipline in 7 years of servitude. The mind left to wander in difficult circumstances wanders toward despair. Keep it occupied, keep it moving forward, give it a problem small enough to solve, and let the solving of small problems build one on top of another until something larger has been accomplished without your ever having to look directly at how large it was. She found a piece of charcoal in the cold ash of what had once been a fire pit, a ring of stones in the center of the main cavern floor blackened and ancient. She took the charcoal to the smoothest section of the cavern wall and began. Day 1. She went through every pot, every bundle, every folded hide, every tool. She worked by the gray light from the passage, moving slowly, touching nothing more than she had to. Her fingers reading the surfaces of objects carefully without assumption, letting the thing itself tell her what it was. The clay pots were sealed with plugs of hardened clay set in what had been beeswax now crystallized to a pale, brittle shell. She broke the seal on the first pot with a careful pressure of her thumbs, and the smell that rose was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Dry and vital and complex. The smell of things preserved against time by skill and intention. Inside separated by thin sheets of birch bark, so dry they crackled like old paper were seeds. Corn dried to a deep amber, unlike anything she had seen in the valley below. Not the pale yellow of the field corn grown on the homesteads. These kernels were darker, smaller, a rich reddish amber, dense and perfect. She set a few in her palm and studied them in the thin light. Something about them felt old in a way that the word old did not fully capture. She could not have explained why. She simply noted it and moved on. Beans came next, mottled brown and cream. Then small dark squash seeds in a separate section. She counted everything. 42 handfuls of corn. She marked it on the wall. Then the beans, then the nuts in another pot, hickory and walnut, and what she recognized as chestnut, all of them dense and preserved as solid as the day they were stored. Another pot held dried herbs, leaves, and roots bundled in small packets tied with grass. The smell of them was green and sharp mint and sage, and several things she could not name. She counted the hides. 11 deer, 3 bear, 2 larger skins she thought might be elk. All of them worked to the same extraordinary softness as the one she had slept under. All of them folded with a neatness that spoke of someone who had organized this space with full knowledge that a stranger might need to find things quickly. She counted the tools, bone needles in their deerskin pouch, flint scrapers in graduated sizes, 2 small hand axes of worked stone, lengths of sinew coiled and dry, a bundle of cordage made from plant fiber still flexible and strong. She marked it all on the wall in charcoal columns. Her handwriting was small and precise, the same handwriting she had pressed into the indenture contract at the age of 12. Now she was writing for no audience but herself, and possibly whatever future person might need to know what was here, and the precision mattered just as much. When she was done, she stood back and looked at the tally. She worked through the arithmetic in her head, comparing what she had against what she would need. It was not comfortable, but it was possible. If she was careful, if she was very careful. She allowed herself 1 handful of corn that first morning, softened in water she collected from a drip deep in the passage where clean water came through the rock in a thin, steady stream into a natural hollow in the stone. She ate it slowly, kernel by kernel, sitting cross-legged in the gray light with the Cherokee map spread across her knees. She still could not read it. The symbols were beautiful complex curves and angles and dots that clearly followed a systematic logic she did not have the key to. But she could read the topology. She had spent her whole life in these mountains, and the lines of the map were the lines she knew. The river valley running southwest, the ridge running northeast, the hollow where Hemlock Creek settled into the lower ground. The waterfall was marked with a particular symbol, and she understood that to be the marker for this place, this cave. From that marker, other lines radiated outward, leading into the mountain in directions she had not yet explored. She traced the lines with one finger, very lightly, not pressing. They had mapped the mountain from the inside. They had known it the way you know a house you have lived in for generations, where every room is familiar and every passage has a name. She folded the map carefully and pressed it back against her skin. She had work to do. The days that followed were among the most physically demanding of her life, which was saying something for a girl who had spent 7 years in field and kitchen labor. But there was a quality to this work entirely different from what she had known at Hale's farm. On the farm, she had worked to maintain something that belonged to someone else. Here, every hour of labor was building something that was entirely, solely, irrevocably hers. She needed fire first, not just for warmth, but for light, for the ability to work after dark, to explore the deeper passages, to cook the dried corn into something the body could use efficiently. The ancient fire pit told her that fire had been maintained here before, which meant there was a way to exhaust the smoke. She spent 2 full days finding it, crawling through the higher passages with her hand held up, feeling for movement in the air until she found the faint upward pull in a narrow fissure near the back wall of the main chamber. She marked it with a scratch of flint, then worked her way back to the pit. The flint scrapers in the cache had 2 purposes she could see. One was working hide. The other was this struck against a piece of quartz from the cave wall. They produced a spark that landed in the dry moss she had gathered from the outer rocks, and caught with a warmth that spread through her chest like something physical. The first fire she built in the ancient ring of stones changed the cavern completely. The light pushed the darkness back to the corners. The smoke pulled itself upward through channels she could not see, but whose function was suddenly made visible. The temperature in the immediate area around the pit rose to something that felt almost generous. She gathered wood in the intervals between rains, venturing out through the waterfall passage into the small sheltered glen at the base of the cliff. The deadfall was abundant, and she cut and split what she could with the hand axes and dragged it back in loads wrapped in a hide she had fashioned into a rough sling. The work left her arms aching to the bone every evening, but the wood pile against the cavern wall grew steadily, and each added bundle was a day's worth of warmth made solid and real. She worked the hides during the hours when the light through the passage was brightest, using the scrapers with the grain of the leather. The way she intuited was correct, watching the surface respond, learning from the material itself what it wanted. She had seen hides worked at Hale's farm, crude and functional, nothing like these. She tried to understand from the finished product how they had been made, working backward from the result. She ruined one hide before she began to understand the right angle and pressure. By the third, she could feel when she was doing it correctly, a kind of ease in the movement, the scraper following a path that the leather itself seemed to indicate. She fashioned herself a sleeping enclosure inside the main chamber, using 4 of the larger hides strung from natural protrusions in the rock wall to create a smaller tent within the larger space. Inside it, she could heat the air with 2 heated stones from the fire and her own body warmth to a temperature that let her sleep deeply and wake without the bone ache of the cold. At night, by firelight, she studied the map. November came with a gradual, serious quality, the mountain tightening around her, the light through the passage lasting fewer hours each day, the temperature outside the cave dropping in stages she could track by the changing sound of the waterfall. Colder water moved differently, had a different density and weight to its sound. She had begun to think she might actually survive this. Then on the 7th of November, the first real test arrived. She had been outside gathering wood when the sky changed. Not gradually. This one came from the north with a speed and authority that left no time for preparation. The temperature dropped as she watched visibly, the breath fogging in front of her face, going from light to dense in the span of minutes. She grabbed the wood sling and moved back toward the cliff face with a focused urgency that did not quite become panic, because panic uses energy, and she had learned to be precise about energy. She was inside the passage with the wood when the sleep began. It came in horizontally, driven by a wind that had genuine violence in it, and within an hour, the world outside the waterfall was white. Not the soft white of a gentle snowfall, but the hard, sheeting white of a storm that means business. A storm that the valley people would later call the first breath of a killer winter. She stayed deep in the mountain for 2 days. She built her fire higher and sat close to it, heating stones and wrapping them in hide scraps and stacking them around the sleeping enclosure. She ate a careful measure of corn mush heated in a clay pot over the coals. She worked on the tunic she had been fashioning from one of the softer deer hides, teaching her hands the use of the bone needles, feeling her way toward a competence that would in time become skill. On the second day of the storm, she pulled her knees to her chest and sat for a long time listening to the changed sound of the waterfall outside. The volume had increased as snowmelt from the higher peaks swelled it. The mountain was in full winter now. It was not hostile toward her. It was simply what it was, vast and indifferent, proceeding according to its own logic. She thought about the people in the valley. She knew how those cabins were built. She had lived in one. She knew how fast the firewood went when the temperature dropped seriously. She knew how the cold found the gaps in the chinking between the logs, how it settled in the corners of rooms and crept across floors. She knew what it meant to lie awake at night counting the remaining days of winter against the remaining days of firewood. In here she was warm. In here she had food. In here the same intelligence that had chosen this location had also engineered the ventilation, the water supply, the structural arrangement of the provisions, so that a person living alone could manage them without waste. The people who built this had not just stored things. They had thought through the entire problem of human survival in this specific place and solved it systematically and elegantly. The knowledge encoded in this cave was not a list of supplies. It was a complete system, and she was living inside it, and the system worked. She pressed her palm to the cold stone of the cavern wall and thought about the hands that had planned all this, the minds that had worked through the problem. She thought of them being pushed out of these mountains by men with deeds and rifles, men who owned things on paper without understanding them in their bones. Men like Edmund Hale, whose relationship to the land was one of extraction and authority, who had never once considered what the land might know that he did not. The people who built this cave had known things Edmund Hale could not have imagined. They had known the mountain from the inside and had been erased, pushed west with nothing. But they had left this. A message sealed in clay and stored in the dark heart of the mountain. A final quiet argument against their own erasure. She understood this not as a thought, but as a feeling deep and not entirely comfortable, the feeling of receiving something you cannot repay. She picked up the bone needle and went back to work on the tunic. In Hemlock Creek, 10 miles below, the winter was doing what winter did. The Miller family had lost 2 children to lung fever by the middle of November, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4 in the same terrible week. The news moved through the settlement in the way of all bad news in small communities, person to person, each telling adding its weight to a shared accumulation of grief and dread. The Millers had done nothing wrong. They had chinked their walls and stored their wood and kept their children warm as best they could. But the cold had found a way in the way it always does when it is cold enough and the walls are not enough, and the fever had done the rest. Old man Hemmings, who lived alone at the far edge of the settlement, was found by his neighbor in his chair beside a cold hearth. His last fire burned to ash sometime in the night. He had been 73 years old and had lived alone for the past decade, and had been, by all accounts, a man who knew what he was doing in these mountains. It had not been enough. The settlement drew inward. Each family became an island focused on its own survival, its own woodpile, and its own stores. People checked on their nearest neighbors and then retreated back to their own hearths. In the small schoolhouse, Owen Greer taught fewer and fewer students as the cold deepened and the parents kept their children home. By December, he was teaching 4 children on most days and sometimes only 2. He kept the school open anyway because it was the only thing he could think to do that made any difference, and because the schoolroom fire was warmer than his own cabin. He was short on food by December. Not desperately so, not yet, but aware of the margins in a way that sharpened his attention. His vegetable garden had yielded less than he had hoped, and the rabbit snares he maintained along the creek bottom had been coming up empty more often than not. In the evenings in his cabin, by the light of one candle, he read everything he had already read, and then read it again. He worked through the Latin grammar he had brought from Philadelphia, declined the nouns, and conjugated the verbs in his head as a form of mental exercise. He played chess against himself. and he studied the Cherokee syllabary clipping pinned above his desk. The partial chart was still only partial, which meant there were still characters he had not decoded, gaps in his understanding that the article had not filled. He found himself constructing hypotheses about the missing characters based on patterns in the ones he knew, trying to reconstruct the logic of the system from the fragments available to him. It was a pleasant intellectual puzzle for a cold evening. It did not occur to him that it was also, in a very direct sense, a matter of life and death for someone he had not yet met. On the mountain above him, Willa Moss was warm and fed and alive. The gap between those two facts was not luck. It was not accident. It was knowledge correctly applied. And every day that passed in the valley below, the distance between those who had it and those who did not made itself known in the most permanent of ways. December deepened and the cold found new registers. Temperatures that the old people in the valley said they had not seen in 20 years settled over the Blue Ridge and stayed. The creek at the bottom of the Hemlock Creek Hollow froze from bank to bank in a single night. On the mountain, Willa had moved into a second phase of her existence in the cave. The survival urgency of the first weeks had given way to something more settled, more considered. She had the fire, the food supply, the sleeping enclosure, the water from the inner drip. The immediate danger was managed. Now she could afford to think. She explored the cave system methodically, using a burning branch as a torch, comparing every passage to the lines on the buckskin map. The map was accurate. Every tunnel she found was marked. Every chamber corresponded to a symbol. She discovered a second cavern off a passage that angled northeast from the main chamber, smaller than the first, its walls embedded with crystalline mica that glittered in the firelight like captured stars. She found a third passage that dropped steeply downward, requiring her to descend hand over hand. Using a rope of knotted hide, she anchored to a protrusion of rock at the top. At the bottom, she found an underground pool, black and perfectly still, fed by the same aquifer that produced the drip in the upper passage. The water was cold and clean and tasted of stone. She began to make her own map on a piece of cured hide, marking in charcoal what she had found, adding her own notations in the margins. Her drawings of the chambers and their contents were precise and detailed, the work of someone who had learned to observe carefully, because observation was the tool that had always been available when others were not. The Cherokee syllabary on the original map remained the largest of her unknowings. A language needed a key. She did not have a key. She set this aside and focused on what she could know. She thought often about those amber corn kernels. She had been eating them for weeks, one careful ration at a time, and something about them nagged at her in a way she could not resolve. They tasted different from any corn she had known, richer and more complex, with a depth that ordinary field corn did not have. The kernels were smaller and denser. She could not explain what she was sensing. She simply noted it the way she noted everything, and filed it carefully in the part of her mind where things waited for a key. January arrived with the full force of what the Valley people would later call the Great Freeze of 1881. The temperature did not rise above freezing for a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. In the valley, the suffering reached a new scale. Livestock died in barns. Wells froze to the bottom. Families burned furniture when the wood ran out. On the mountain in the cave, Willa Moss ground corn on a flat stone and heated the meal over her fire, and ate it slowly in the warm dark, listening to the waterfall outside the stone wall, shifting in register as the cold changed its character. She thought about the valley below most nights. Not with guilt, because she had not caused anyone suffering, and survivor's guilt requires a false premise. She thought about it with a clear analytical sadness. The difference between her situation and the situation of the families freezing in their cabins was not primarily a matter of resources. Both she and they existed in the same mountains with access to the same raw materials. The difference was knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge of how to read the mountain, how to work with it rather than against it, how to store not just food, but the understanding of food, not just wood, but the understanding of fire. The people who had built this cave had possessed that knowledge completely. They had been removed before they could pass it on, in the ordinary way, parent to child across generations. But they had left this. They had understood, or perhaps simply hoped, that the knowledge itself was worth preserving, even if the people who carried it could not be. She was warm because of their foresight. She was alive because they had thought beyond their own survival to the survival of whoever came after. She intended to be worthy of that. It was a Tuesday in early February when she heard the sound at the lower entrance. She had found the lower entrance in January during one of her systematic explorations of the map. A passage that angled downward from the back of the second chamber, narrower than the main entrance, opening finally into the face of the cliff, about half a mile down the creek from the waterfall, hidden behind a dense thicket of rhododendron. It was marked on the map with a specific symbol she had come to understand meant passage or door, and it offered an alternative exit from the cave system that did not require navigating the icy rocks behind the waterfall. On that Tuesday in February, she was in the main chamber working on a second pair of moccasins when she heard the sound. A scraping at the rock. Then a sound unmistakably human, a low involuntary sound of effort and pain coming from the direction of the lower passage. She was on her feet and to the passage entrance in seconds, moving quietly, pressing herself against the wall and listening. The sounds were getting closer, slow and labored. The sounds of someone struggling with the passage itself, not with any knowledge of what lay inside. That told her it was not Roy Hale who would have come in force and with purpose. This was someone cold and slow who was crawling toward the warmth they could feel coming up through the rock. She waited. The man who emerged from the lower passage into the edge of the firelight was so cold, he was the color of chalk. He was thin with round spectacles, so fogged with condensed breath she could not see his eyes behind them. He was wearing a coat entirely inadequate for February in the Blue Ridge, a town coat wool designed for cold streets rather than mountain wilderness. His hands, which he was using to push himself upright against the cavern wall, were shaking with a tremor that was well past voluntary. He looked up and saw her, and his expression went through several phases. Quickly, fear, confusion, a desperate relief that overtook everything else. She recognized him. The schoolteacher from Hemlock Creek, Owen Greer. She had seen him twice, both times from a distance, once at the general store, and once walking along the creek road with a stack of books under his arm. She did not know him, but she knew what he was, which was not a threat. She crossed the chamber to him, took his arm and moved him toward the fire, with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood hypothermia and knew the order of priorities. She sat him down on the stone closest to the heat. She put a hide around his shoulders. She put the clay pot with the remaining corn mush back over the coals to warm it. She did not ask him anything. There was nothing to ask that mattered right now. He was cold and he needed to be warm. Everything else could wait. He sat by the fire for a long time, shaking and then gradually not shaking. The color came back to his face, slowly moving from chalk to gray to something closer to human. His eyes, once he had wiped his spectacles, moved around the cavern. With an expression she recognized, the expression of someone whose understanding of what is possible is being revised in real time. She gave him the corn mush. He ate it slowly with both hands wrapped around the pot and did not say anything for a while. Then he told her he had seen smoke from the ventilation flue. He had followed it for 3 days, losing it and finding it again. He had thought he was following a chimney, some homestead he did not know about, and had been surprised to find that the smoke led into a mountainside. He told her about the valley, the Miller children, Hemmings, 3 other families near the end of their stores. He told her he had given away the last of his own food 2 weeks ago and had been living on creek water in 1 rabbit every 4 days since then. She listened to all of this. When he was done, she stood up and went to the clay pots and began to measure out portions of dried corn and beans into a smaller pot. Not a small portion. A real one, a portion for a man who had been starving for 2 weeks. He said she did not need to do that. She said nothing because the statement did not require a response. She had the food. He needed it. The rest was arithmetic. While he ate, she brought out the buckskin map and spread it on the flat stone between them. She watched his face. He stopped eating. He leaned forward, and the expression that came over him was something she had not seen on an adult face in a long time. A pure, uncomplicated excitement, the look of someone who has just seen a problem they immediately want to solve. He said very quietly that he could read this. She had suspected from the moment she recognized him that there might be a reason the map had waited this long to be found. She was not superstitious. She did not believe in fate in any organized sense. But she believed in the accumulation of small individual choices producing outcomes that no single person had intended or controlled. Owen Greer had pinned a newspaper clipping to a wall months before he had any reason to. She had found a map she could not read. The winter had driven him up the mountain. None of those things were miraculous. All of them were explicable. But together they formed a chain. She asked him how well he knew the characters. He said well enough to start. He said he had been studying a partial chart for months and had filled in some of the gaps through logical inference. He said he was not certain of everything, but was certain of the principles. She said that was enough. She moved the fire higher, adding 2 good-sized pieces of deadfall to the coals. The light expanded in the chamber, warm and steady, pushing the shadows back to the edges. Outside, beyond the stone, the winter continued its siege of the valley below. Inside the cave, in the heat and the light, Owen Greer bent over the buckskin map with a focused intensity that reminded her of a man who has been waiting his whole life for a specific problem and has just met it. His finger traced a line of symbols from the waterfall marker down through a cluster of signs below, and to the east in an area of the map she had not been able to interpret. He read them slowly, one character at a time, then again putting the sounds together. Then he looked up at her. He said the symbols translated as best he could determine to something like this: beneath the water, the second library. She was very still. She looked at the map. She looked at the symbol he was pointing to below and east of the main cave marker. She looked at the line that led from it downward into the stone. She looked at the area of the map she had thought was simply the deeper cave, the underground pool she had already found. And she realized she had not gone far enough. She had found the pool and stopped. She had not looked at what lay beyond it. She looked up at the stone floor beneath her feet. In the silence between one breath and the next, she could hear it. Very faint, very far below, the sound of water moving through rock. She said it quietly to herself as much as to him. They did not hide only food. They hid everything they knew. Owen Greer looked at her. Then he looked back at the map. Then he looked at the floor beneath them both. The fire crackled. The waterfall hummed beyond the stone. And in the warm heart of the mountain, 2 people sat with a map between them and understood for the first time what it was really pointing to. The rope was 3 lengths of knotted hide, each length the span of her outstretched arms tied end to end and anchored around a shoulder of granite that jutted from the floor of the lower passage like the prow of a buried ship. Willa had made it in 2 hours the morning after Owen translated the map, working the knots with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, now testing each one with her full body weight before moving to the next. Owen had watched her work without offering to help, which she appreciated. He understood without being told that this was not the kind of task you assisted with. This was the kind of task you witnessed. The shaft descended from a crack in the floor of the passage connecting the main chamber to the underground pool. She had passed over it a dozen times without looking down because it appeared at a glance to be a narrow fissure with no particular depth. But Owen's translation had redirected her attention, and when she lay flat on the stone and held her burning torch over the opening, the light fell downward for a long time before it found anything to illuminate. She went down first. Owen held the rope at the top braced against the granite shoulder. She did not ask him if he was strong enough. The question would have embarrassed them both, and besides, she could feel in the rope's tension that he was not going to let go. The descent took longer than she expected. The shaft was not entirely vertical. It angled twisted once through a narrow section that required her to turn sideways in the dark, then opened into a wider space where she could brace her feet against the wall and work her way down more easily. The air changed as she descended. It became warmer, which surprised her, and the smell changed too, becoming earthier, older, carrying something she could not immediately identify. Then her feet found stone, and she was standing in the dark at the bottom of the shaft, and she lifted the torch. She stood without moving for a long time. Long enough that Owen's voice came down from above, asking if she was all right, and she did not answer immediately because she did not have words immediately available. The chamber was larger than the main cavern above. Its ceiling was lost in shadow beyond the reach of the torchlight. The walls were not granite, but a paler stone that caught the torch's light differently, almost luminous, and across these walls from floor to as high as she could reach, and beyond were the skins. Not hides prepared for clothing or bedding. These were writing skins. Pieces of deer hide and elk hide and other materials she could not immediately identify, each one stretched flat and cured and covered edge to edge in the precise flowing characters of the Cherokee syllabary. They were hung on the walls in overlapping rows, each one tied at its corners with braided grass cord to small pegs of wood driven into the stone. There were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100, each one dense with writing so fine and so carefully executed that it looked in the torchlight like the illuminated pages of a manuscript from some great library of the old world. On the floor, arranged in the same careful order as the provisions above, were rolls of smaller skin, each one bound with sinew, each carrying a symbol on its outer surface that she recognized from the map. Not random symbols, organized, categorized, filed. She reached up and touched the nearest wall, hanging very gently, one fingertip at the edge. The skin was dry and completely preserved. The pigment was as crisp and dark as the day it had been applied. This was not a second cache. This was not more food or more tools. This was something of an entirely different order. She called up to Owen that she needed him to come down. He made the descent, clumsily scraping his coat against the narrow section, losing one of his spectacle lenses in the dark, and then finding it again by feel. When he finally stood beside her and raised his torch and saw the walls, he made a sound she had not heard from him before and hoped she would hear from him again. A sound of pure and voluntary awe, the sound of a man whose entire framework for understanding what is possible has just been quietly dismantled and rebuilt around a larger truth. He walked to the nearest wall hanging and bent close, holding his torch at an angle to read without glare. His lips moved. He moved to the next, then the next. He was moving faster now, touching the edges of the skins with his fingertips, scanning rather than reading fully the way a person does when they suddenly understand that they are in the presence of more than they can immediately process. He stopped at a section of wall where 4 large skins hung side by side, covered in symbols that looked different from the others, more geometric with small illustrations worked between the lines of text. He looked at these for a long time. Then he turned to her, and she could see, even in the difficult light of the torches, that his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He said, "This is everything." She waited for him to be more specific. He turned back to the wall and began to translate aloud. Slowly stopping to work out characters, he was less certain of building sentences from fragments. The 4 large skins were a geological and botanical survey of the entire mountain range. Not a rough sketch. A systematic, detailed record organized by elevation and season and soil type of every significant mineral deposit and medicinal plant within a day's walk of the cave. The small illustrations were diagrams precise and accurate of plant structures and rock formations, and the relationships between water sources and the mineral veins that ran beside them. There was a section on the mica deposits. The map had shown her only the veins she had found in the second chamber. The geological survey showed 7 additional veins ranging across the mountain in patterns the Cherokee had recorded with the accuracy of people who had studied this ground for generations. There was a section on plants, the longest and most densely written section, and Owen could only translate parts of it. Detailed instructions for the preparation of medicinal remedies from plants that grew on specific slopes at specific elevations. Records of which plants grew in association with which others and what those associations indicated about the soil and the water. A catalog of edible plants organized by season with notes on preparation methods that made the difference between a plant being nutritious and harmful. Then Owen stopped at one of the rolled skins on the floor. He picked it up carefully, untied it, and translated the symbol on its cover. He looked at her and said the word, ginseng. The American ginseng root, which grew in the deep, rich soils of mature hardwood forests in the southern Appalachians, was the most valuable wild plant in the mountains. A single pound of dried root could bring a price in the eastern markets equal to weeks of farm labor. Traders came from as far as Philadelphia looking for it. Families supplemented their incomes by harvesting it from the wild, but the populations had been declining for decades as the harvesting exceeded what the forest could regenerate. The rolled skin contained a map of ginseng populations across the mountain marked with symbols that Owen translated as harvest and leave and return in 3 years and do not touch. A management system. Not exploitation, but cultivation. A method of taking only what the population could sustain, ensuring that the resource would be there next year, and the year after, and the year after that. Willa sat on the floor of the underground chamber with this rolled skin in her hands and felt the full weight of what she was holding. Not just the commercial weight, though, that was real and not inconsiderable. Something larger. These people had understood something about the relationship between use and preservation that the settlers in the valley below did not know and would not learn in most cases until it was too late to matter. They had understood that the mountain was not a resource to be drawn down until empty. It was a system to be participated in carefully and with the long view always in mind. And they had written it all down, every bit of it. They had written it down and hidden it in the heart of the mountain against the possibility that they would be gone, but someone else would need to know. She sat for a long time in that underground room in the warmth that came up through the stone from somewhere deeper still, with a torch burning low and the walls covered in the accumulated knowledge of a people who had been pushed off this land before most of her grandparents were born. She thought about her mother guiding her small hand to the pen. She thought about Edmund Hale's face, the flat patience of a man who had never once doubted that the world was arranged correctly and that his place in it was appropriate. She thought about the Miller children. She thought about what it meant to possess knowledge truly in your hands and your memory and your understanding versus what it meant to possess a deed, a document, a piece of paper with a name on it. One kind of possession she understood in that moment can be taken from you in an afternoon. The other kind lives in the body, in the hands that have done the work, in the eyes that have learned to read a mountain the way other people read a page. Nobody takes that. Nobody can. Owen set down the rolled skin he had been reading and looked at her across the torchlight. He said very quietly that whatever was in this room needed to be properly documented and preserved. That there were people at universities who had spent their entire careers hoping to find something like this. That the botanical and geological information alone was worth more to science than anything he had encountered in his professional life. She nodded. She had already been thinking about this. She said, but carefully. He said yes, carefully. The words settled between them in the warm dark like a commitment, which is exactly what it was. They came back up from the lower chamber in the late afternoon. Owen went first, which required her to brace the rope from below, while he made the ascent with considerably more difficulty than the descent had required. She came up after him moving quickly, her arms strong from weeks of wood hauling and hide working. In the main chamber by the fire, Owen began to create a systematic record of what the lower chamber contained, working in the organized manner of someone trained in scholarship, categorizing and cross-referencing his handwriting, small and precise, on the hide scraps she gave him. She watched him work and thought about what came next. It was clear to her, and had been clear since she first held the buckskin map in her hands by the thin light of the passage, that this knowledge was not meant to be kept. It had not been stored in darkness because it was meant to stay in darkness. It had been stored in darkness because darkness was the only safe place available. The intention had been return and retrieval and use. The people who built this library had been removed before they could retrieve it. She was the retrieval. She understood this not as a mystical proposition, but as a practical one. She was here, she had found it, and she had two choices. She could keep it to herself, which would make her comfortable, but would serve no one else. Or she could do something with it. The first thing she needed to do was secure her right to be here at all. She explained this to Owen that evening, sitting across the fire from him, speaking more than she usually did because the situation required precision. She needed to file a mineral claim. The mica vein in the second chamber was sufficient basis for a legal claim on this section of the mountain under Virginia mining law. She had enough of an education to know that much from the courthouse records she had helped Hale's wife file once years ago in a different life. If she had the claim, she had the legal standing. If she had the legal standing, she had the right to be here that no man with a deed to farmland in the valley below could contest. Owen listened to all of this and then said quietly that he could help with the filing. He knew the county registrar. He knew the legal language required. She said she knew he could. That was why she was telling him. He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. Then he said he wanted to be clear about something. He said this was her place, her discovery, her claim. Whatever assistance he provided was precisely that assistance. He was not a partner in the ownership of anything here. He was a translator and a witness, and if she would have him, a friend. She looked at him for a moment. In 7 years on Edmund Hale's farm, no adult had ever said anything like that to her. She said that would be acceptable. They went down the mountain on a clear morning in the third week of February, when the cold had relented for 2 consecutive days and the creek road was passable. Willa went dressed in the deer-hide tunic she had made over the long winter months, her feet in the moccasins she had fashioned from the softer skins, carrying in a hide sack, a piece of mica the size of her palm, and a copy of the map she had made in charcoal on a prepared skin. She did not bring the original map or any of the original materials from the lower chamber. Those stayed in the cave, which she sealed behind her with the stone barrier she had built and reinforced across the long months of winter. The Augusta County Courthouse was 12 miles down the valley road from Hemlock Creek. It took them most of the day to get there, walking a road that was half ice and half mud in the February thaw. The registrar's office was a small room at the back of the courthouse, heated by a cast iron stove, and containing behind its wooden counter a man named Harlan Dodd, who had held this position for 11 years and who viewed his role as the guardian of procedural correctness above all earthly concerns. He was 50 or so, with the particular manner of a man who has learned that most of the people who come to his counter are either confused or trying something improper, and who has decided to treat all of them with equal suspicion until proven otherwise. He looked at Willa over the counter with an expression that was entirely assessment. He took in the deerskin clothing, the moccasins, the clear dark eyes that did not look away from his. He took in Owen Greer standing beside her, whom he recognized vaguely from some courthouse transaction years before. He asked who she was and what she wanted. She set the piece of mica on the counter in front of him. It caught the light from the window and threw it back in a dozen directions at once. Harlan Dodd looked at it involuntarily, the way anyone does when something unexpectedly beautiful appears directly in front of them. She said her name was Willa Moss, and that she wished to file a mineral claim on a section of mountain land in the upper Hemlock Creek watershed based on discovery of a significant deposit of muscovite mica. Dodd looked at the mica, then he looked at her. He said in the tone of a man performing due diligence that she would need to demonstrate discovery and occupation of the site in question. She reached into the hide sack and set the charcoal map on the counter, unrolled it flat with both hands. Beside it, she placed her copy of the tally, the columns of charcoal figures she had transcribed from the cavern wall. Day 1 through day 112. 112 days in a cave in the Blue Ridge in the worst winter in 20 years. Owen Greer said that he could attest to having personally visited the site and found Miss Moss in occupation with established shelter fire and provisions sufficient for extended habitation. Dodd looked at the map. He looked at the tally. He looked back at Willa. She waited. She was very good at waiting. Harlan Dodd pulled a form from the drawer behind him and set it on the counter and dipped his pen in the inkwell. He asked her to spell her name. She spelled it, the same letters, the same deliberate care that she had pressed into the indenture contract at the age of 12. Willa Moss. She watched Harlan Dodd write her name in the ledger of mineral claims for Augusta County, Virginia, in the year 1881, and felt something settle inside her that had not been settled since the day her mother guided her hand to that pen. It was done. It was legal. It was hers. Spring came to the Blue Ridge in stages tentatively. At first, one warm day, followed by 2 cold ones, then 2 warm days, followed by 1 cold, until the balance shifted and stage shifted, and the mountain began to remember green. Edmund Hale's winter had been catastrophic. He had lost most of his cattle in the January freeze, a combination of extreme cold and the fact that his barn was older and less well insulated than he had believed. The fire that took the barn in late January, started by an overheated stovepipe that Roy had not properly maintained, destroyed not just the structure, but the hay stored within it, which had been the only remaining feed for the animals that survived the freeze. By February, Hale's farm was operating on margins that would not sustain it. He had borrowed against his land the previous autumn, a decision that had seemed reasonable at the time and now looked like a slow-moving catastrophe. The creditor in the county seat was not an unsympathetic man, but he was a realistic one, and the terms of the loan did not bend simply because the winter had been unusually harsh. The rumors about the cave had reached him by mid-February, carried by the same trapper who had seen the smoke the previous November. People in Hemlock Creek had begun to talk about the ghost of the Upper Hollow in a different register. Not a mystery to be explained, but a fact to be accounted for. Someone was living above the snow line. Someone had food enough to share in a winter that was killing livestock and children. Several valley families had received anonymously at first, and then with increasing openness, packages of dried food left at their doors during the worst weeks of the freeze. Corn, dried beans, hickory nuts portions, exact enough to be useful without being so large as to be incomprehensible. Edmund Hale was not a man who accepted mysteries. He was a man who believed that everything had an explanation that could be located and controlled. And the explanation for the ghost of the Upper Hollow was, he was increasingly certain, his former indentured servant. He climbed the mountain on a morning in late March alone. He did not bring Roy. He did not bring his rifle. He understood in a way that he might not have been able to articulate, but that some practical intelligence in him had worked out that he was not going up there to confront a fugitive. He was going up there to assess the situation and possibly to negotiate his way into it. He found the lower entrance without much difficulty. The rhododendron thicket was beginning to bud at the edges, and the passage through it was visible if you pressed close enough to the rock face. He made his way through the lower passage and up into the main chamber. The fire was burning in the stone ring. Two people were working on opposite sides of it. Owen Greer was bent over a flat stone writing on a piece of prepared hide, his spectacles pushed up on his forehead in the manner of a man working close. The young woman was on the other side sorting pieces of mica. By some quality Hale could not immediately determine, her hands moving quickly and surely through the material. She looked up when he came in. She did not startle. She did not stand up immediately. She simply registered his presence with the stillness of someone who has been expecting a particular thing and is now noting that it has arrived on schedule. Owen looked up too and set his pen aside and rose to his feet. Edmund Hale stood at the edge of the firelight and looked around the cave. He had not known what to expect. He had prepared himself in a vague way for poverty, for desperation, for the physical evidence of a person barely surviving. What he found was something that no part of his preparation had accounted for. The cavern was warm. Not barely warm, but genuinely warm, the warmth of a space that had been well managed through a hard winter. The walls were smooth and dry. The woodpile against the far wall was still substantial. The clay pots were ranked in their original order along the base of the wall. Hides were hanging at intervals, some in process, some finished. Tools were arranged on a flat stone ledge near the fire, with the orderliness of a well-kept workshop. The mica on the sorting stone caught the firelight and threw it outward in every direction, turning the rough walls of the cave into something that shimmered and shifted with every small movement of the air. He said what he had prepared to say. He said she still owed him time, 3 years by his reckoning. He said he was not an unreasonable man and was prepared to discuss terms. He said the cave was on his land or adjacent to it, and there were legal questions about her presence here that a court might find interesting. He said all of this in the measured, reasonable tone he had perfected over decades of dealing with people who had less power than he did. Willa Moss set down the piece of mica she had been sorting. She rose without hurry. There was nothing in her posture that invited argument. She looked like someone who had already had this conversation in her own mind 100 times over the long winter months and had long since decided how it ended. She said, "You tore that contract yourself, not me." She reached into the fold of her tunic and removed a folded piece of paper and placed it on the flat stone between them. He looked at it. It was a legal document. The language was precise and formal and entirely legible. Mineral claim on a specified section of the Shenandoah Upland, Augusta County, Virginia, filed by Willa Moss, witnessed by Owen Greer, registered with the county registrar. Dated February 23, 1881. The paper that bound a people to things. He knew better than anyone how much power lived in a document, in the right words written by the right authority in the right ledger. He had used that power his entire adult life to bind people to agreements that served him to define the terms of other people's existences. The document on the stone was the same instrument put to a different purpose by a different hand. Owen Greer stepped forward from the far side of the fire. Not aggressively, he simply moved to a position that clarified the geometry of the room, standing slightly to Willa's left, a witness and a presence. He said that if Hale had concerns about the boundary of the claim, the county surveyor had already been contacted and would be making his assessment in the spring. He said that any unauthorized presence on the claimed land in the interim would be a matter for the county sheriff. Hale looked at the document. He looked at the mica on the sorting stone, which was throwing firelight in a dozen directions at once. He looked at the woodpile and the sealed pots and the tools arranged on their ledge with the orderliness of a place that had been seriously inhabited by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He looked finally at the document on the stone between them. The paper he could not argue with, signed by an authority he himself had always deferred to without question. The law, which he had always assumed was arranged in his favor, had been used here with a precision he had not anticipated and could not counter. Edmund Hale was a man who had built his life on other people's vulnerability, not because he was uniquely evil, but because it had always worked, because the world he inhabited had been arranged to make it work, because the law and the custom and the social order had always ultimately been arranged in his favor. None of that was true here. He had walked into a room where the arrangements were entirely different, and he did not have the tools to function in it. The woman across from him had spent a winter learning to make tools from bone and flint. He had spent that same winter watching his barn burn. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the stone floor when he came in. He did not say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the lower passage. He walked carefully. He maintained his bearing until he was out of their sight, and perhaps after that too, though no one could say for certain. What was certain was that he did not come back. The county surveyor came in April, a practical man named Bertram Cole, who chewed tobacco and said very little and measured everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his measurements would outlast him. He confirmed the mineral claim boundaries, noted the mica deposit in his report as significant and commercially viable, and filed his findings with the county office without commentary. The Moss mica claim was entered in the permanent record. Word moved through the valley slowly and thoroughly, reaching everyone eventually. Some people found it remarkable. Some people found it entirely reasonable once they thought about it, that the girl who had survived the worst winter in memory had also managed to do so on her own terms. The families who had received the anonymous packages of food during the freeze felt in retrospect a complicated gratitude that they expressed in practical ways, appearing at the base of the mountain in the spring, with tools and labor and an unstated but clear willingness to be useful. Edmund Hale said nothing publicly. He retreated into the diminished landscape of his remaining assets. In his private bitterness, a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone he had never taken seriously enough to consider an opponent. In May, when the mountain was fully green and the waterfall was running at its highest spring volume, Willa and Owen prepared a careful package for the Botanical Sciences Department at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. It contained samples of 3 plant specimens from the Lower Chambers Botanical Survey, dried and carefully labeled with their Cherokee names, rendered phonetically in Owen's handwriting, along with a brief letter explaining their provenance and inviting scholarly inquiry. The letter was deliberately incomplete. It said the specimens had been obtained from a historically significant Cherokee site in the Augusta County uplands. It said additional materials might be made available to serious scholars under appropriate conditions. It did not say what those conditions were. It did not say how many additional materials existed. Also in the package, separated by birch bark, in the manner she had learned from the sealed pots themselves, were 3 of the amber corn kernels from the first sealed pot, the ones that had fed her through the darkest weeks of the winter, the ones that had tasted different from anything she had known. The reply came in late June from a professor of botany who had been studying Appalachian plant communities for 20 years, and who was, to put it plainly, barely coherent with excitement. His letter ran to 3 pages and barely stopped for breath. One of the 3 plant specimens was a medicinal variety he had been seeking for a decade, documented in 18th century Cherokee accounts, but not physically located in living memory. The second was a root whose properties had been described by early European naturalists and then lost to science entirely. But it was the corn that undid him. The corn he wrote and then crossed out and then wrote again. The corn was a variety he had believed to be extinct. Not rare, not endangered, extinct. It had been documented in a single 18th century account of Cherokee agricultural practice, described with enough specificity that botanists had been confident in the identification and had not been seen since. The physical characteristics matched exactly: the coloring, the size, the density of the kernels. He had been eating it. She had been eating it, one careful handful at a time through the worst winter. In 20 years, the reddish-amber corn that tasted different from anything she had known had been sustaining her, and she had been sustaining it, carrying it forward through the winter by the simple act of careful rationing. She had not consumed it all. She had not wasted it. She had treated it with the same respect she had brought to everything in the cave, taking only what she needed and leaving the rest intact. She had been doing, without knowing it, exactly what the Cherokee had always done with this mountain, using it carefully, taking only what she needed, and leaving the rest for whatever came after. She read the professor's letter twice, sitting on the flat stone outside the lower entrance, with the May light warm on her face, and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride and more permanent. The sense of having been, without knowing it, part of something larger than herself, of having carried something forward that was not hers to own, but was hers to protect. She wrote back to the professor and said he was welcome to correspond. A visit would be considered in time. She was not being obstructive. She was being careful in the way of someone who understands that knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken by force, and that the second most important thing about knowledge is knowing when to share it and when to hold it. The Moss Mica operation, as it came to be known in the valley, never grew large. That was intentional. Willa hired 4 men from Hemlock Creek in the first summer, all of them from families she knew had suffered particularly in the winter, and she paid them well and was clear from the beginning about the principles of the operation. The mica would be harvested from the main vein in the second chamber. The lower chamber would remain undisturbed except for scholarly purposes under her direct supervision. The mountain would not be blasted or dug beyond what was necessary. Men who had spent their lives working land that belonged to other people understood intuitively the value of working for someone who treated the resource with respect. They worked carefully and without being told twice. Owen used the income from the first season's mica harvest to build a new schoolroom in Hemlock Creek, larger than the original, with better windows and a proper floor and a stove that actually drew correctly. He taught every child in the valley who would come, and he expanded what he taught to include botany and basic geology, using the Cherokee surveys as the foundation for lessons about the mountain that surrounded the children who sat in his room. He taught them to read the slope of the land for water. He taught them which plants on the north-facing ridges could treat fever and which could not. He taught them what the sound of the waterfall meant in different weather. He never married. He taught for the rest of his working life in Hemlock Creek and died there in his house beside the creek in 1921 at the age of 78, with his spectacles on his nose and a book open on his chest, and his worn copy of the Cherokee syllabary chart still pinned above his desk, soft and gray, with handling and years. Willa built a small cabin near the base of the waterfall cliff, a stone and timber structure she built herself over the course of a summer with the help of 2 of the mica miners, who were also carpenters. It was solid and well insulated and had a window that looked directly at the waterfall. She lived in it for the rest of her life. But in winter, she always moved back into the cave. Every year when the cold settled in and the waterfall's register deepened and the mountain tightened around itself, she moved her bedding and her provisions back through the passage and lit the fire in the ancient stone ring and settled into the deep geothermal warmth of the place that had saved her. She said once to a young woman from one of the valley families who had come to ask her about plant remedies that the cabin was where she slept in summer. The cave was where she thought. Edmund Hale died in 1899 on his reduced farm in a house that had grown shabbier through the 2 decades following the hard winter. Roy Hale left the valley sometime in the mid-1880s and was not heard from again in Hemlock Creek. The farm passed to a creditor who sold it, and the new owner let the upper land go back to forest, which it did with the speed and thoroughness that abandoned farmland always reverts in the southern mountains. The families that Willa had supplied with food through the winter of 1881 did not forget it. That kind of help given quietly and without condition in the worst of circumstances creates a loyalty that is not sentimental but structural. It becomes part of how a community understands itself, part of the accounting of who was there when it mattered. Willa Moss was in that accounting, and her presence in the valley's life was shaped by it for decades. She became over the years a figure people came to with specific things. Not general advice, not the platitudes of the village wise woman. Specific things. Which plant growing along the north-facing slopes could be made into a poultice for infected wounds? Where the iron-rich spring was the one the Cherokee survey had marked that was good for certain kinds of weakness. How to read the mountain's weather from the sound of the waterfall rather than the look of the sky. How to store food so that it lasted. How to use what you had without wasting it. She shared all of it. Every bit of knowledge she had taken from the lower chamber and translated with Owen's help and tested in practice, she shared with anyone who came to her with a genuine need. The knowledge belongs to anyone who wants it, she said more than once to more than one person. It was the Cherokee who had made that true. She was simply the relay. The cave's location remained her own throughout her lifetime. The knowledge of what it contained conveyed gradually and deliberately to people who could use it correctly, moved outward from the mountain, the way water moves outward from a spring in whatever direction the ground allows, finding the places where it is needed. She died in her sleep in the cave on a warm night in May of 1937 at the age of 76. She had gone in the previous October, as she always did when the cold came, and she had simply not come out the following spring. The miner who found her said she was lying in her sleeping enclosure entirely composed with one hand resting open on the stone floor beside her palm, up as if she had set something down and had not needed to pick it up again. She was buried in the small plot overlooking the creek in the shadow of the mountain, in a grave marked with a piece of unworked granite from the second chamber wall, which she had chosen for this purpose years before, and set aside with a practical specificity that everyone who knew her recognized as entirely characteristic. Her estate left the mineral claim and the cabin to the Hemlock Creek Community School. A sealed letter went to the University of North Carolina to be opened at the discretion of her executor, which was the oldest surviving member of the Miller family, the family whose children had died in the winter of 1881. The sealed letter contained the location of the lower chamber and a complete inventory of its contents in Willa's careful hand, with Owen Greer's translations noted in the margins in his smaller, more angular script. The two hands were immediately distinguishable. Hers was upright and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write as an act of self-assertion and had never lost that quality of intention. His was the handwriting of a man who had spent his life among books, quick and compressed. Together, they covered every page. The letter was not opened until 1952, when the executor's granddaughter, who had inherited the responsibility without fully understanding it, finally brought it to a historian at the university who knew enough to understand what he was reading. By then, it had been sitting in a cedar box for 15 years. The knowledge had waited that long already. It could wait a little longer. The university held the letter and its contents for 3 decades, passing it through several departments, each of which understood it partially and passed it on. It was the botanical section that finally generated sufficient institutional energy to act in the early 1980s, when a junior professor named Patricia Holloway had the sense to follow the thread all the way back to its source. On the morning of September 14, 1983, Dr. Patricia Holloway and her graduate student Daniel pressed through the narrow fissure behind Alderman Falls and stood in the main chamber of the cave for the first time in their lives. Patricia had followed the thread for 2 years. The Botanical Journal footnote, the mineral claim, the sealed letter in the university archive, the deed, the 2 newspaper accounts, one sensationalized and one simply factual, both written in 1881 and both describing in their different registers the same impossible fact that a 19-year-old girl had been cast out into the Blue Ridge in October and had not only survived the worst winter in 20 years, but had emerged from it with a legal claim to mountain land, a scholarly correspondence underway, and a reputation in the valley below that would outlast everyone who had tried to diminish her. Patricia had spent her career studying what people left behind. She had excavated sites from Georgia to Maine and had learned to read the residue of human habitation the way other people read text. She had a practiced eye for the difference between the accidental and the intentional, between what was left because it could not be carried and what was left because it was meant to stay. Daniel swept his flashlight beam across the charcoal tally and read aloud. Day 1, corn 42 handfuls. Patricia stood very still with her hand flat against the stone wall beside the columns of small, precise figures. The rock was cool under her palm, absolutely solid, absolutely real. She looked at the writing for a long time. The columns were neat and the figures were accurate, and the letters were the letters of someone who had learned to write as an act of deliberate self-definition. Not the rounded beginner's hand of someone taught in childhood comfort. The upright, intentional hand of someone who had learned because it mattered, because it was a tool, because being able to write your name clearly was a form of resistance. Day 1, corn 42 handfuls. The first act of survival is always the same. Take stock of what exists and work from there. Do not look at the whole. Look at what is in your hands right now. Count it, write it down, make it real. Daniel had moved deeper into the chamber. His flashlight found something on the floor near the back wall, a small object that had rolled against the base of the mica vein and stayed there in the cold and the dark for longer than either of them had been alive. He crouched down and picked it up carefully, turning it over in his gloved hand. It was a bone needle, no longer than his little finger, still sharp at its tip, after all the years in the cool, dry air of the cave. Still threaded, a length of dried sinew ran through the eye, the end tied in a small knot so that it would not pull through. The sinew had survived perfectly pale and strong, coiled against the needle like something sleeping. He held it out to Patricia without speaking. She took it in her gloved hand and turned it over once. It was the kind of object that archaeologists spend careers hoping to find, not because it was rare in the general sense, but because of what it meant here in this specific place in the context of this specific story. Someone had set this down, mid-stitch perhaps, or at the end of a day's work, or simply because their hands were tired. They had set it down, and it had stayed exactly where they left it, as if time had agreed to hold its breath. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook. There was a great deal to do, more than she had dared to hope, and she had been hoping for quite a lot. Below their feet down a shaft she did not yet know existed a room full of writing, waited in the same patient dark where it had been waiting since before anyone still living had been born. A library. A complete record of a mountain and the people who had known it best, preserved against the long possibility of being needed again. The woman who had written day one on this wall had known she was not the first to inhabit this knowledge. She had understood herself as a link in a chain, a relay point, someone through whom something old and valuable could pass forward into whatever came next. She had held it carefully and used it wisely and shared it generously and left it at the end as she had found it intact, organized, ready for whoever came after. Patricia Holloway put on her work gloves and began. Outside, Alderman Falls moved in its old register, carrying snowmelt from the higher peaks down through the granite and into the valley below, the same water it had always carried, going where it had always gone, faithful to the gravity of the mountain that had made it what it was. The sound of it came through the stone walls of the cave as a low, resonant hum, steady and patient, and entirely indifferent to the passage of years. A woman had once stood in this cave and heard that sound for the first time, and understood it after a few minutes as company rather than noise. She had slept her first night here with that sound in her ears, and woken in the morning with a clear mind and a steady hand, and the understanding that she had work to do. The work, it turned out, was not finished. It had simply passed from one set of hands to another, the way all essential work does, moving through time. Not in spite of the people who carry it, but because of them. Because of the specific and irreplaceable quality of their attention, because of what they noticed and what they wrote down and what they chose to preserve. The needle in Patricia's hand was still threaded. The work, it said, was not finished. She began to write.